Welcome to my uncle's place. I'm Scott Rubel, and I'm the nephew of Michael, who is the mastermind of this castle. I started helping out around here right when he started mixing concrete in 1968. I was only 12 years old. I grew up in the same house he grew up in. He used to just ride down there on his horse, and to me, he was like the Lone Ranger. You know, I'd be playing in the yard, and here he comes riding his horse down to our house to see us. So he was definitely a hero to me and somebody to follow. As he grew up, in the house his grandfather built in 1939, it was right across the river from a giant plot of land where the city laid in all its scrap material. His only experience in building came from the towers he built as a child. His first trip to Europe was when he was 18. He did complete high school there, but he didn't just come home. He got on a motorcycle and took off, and he saw the world. He visited so many countries. Some of these countries were pretty hard. There's all these letters that he wrote, and he had a rubber stamp that said no return address, because he never knew where he was writing these letters from. The turning point in his life came from being bailed out of a jail in Egypt. You know, he got in trouble everywhere, so he was always looking for adventure. So the first day he was in jail, it was one guard, you know, and a couple days later there were 4 guards, and by the end of the week there were 8 guards. And they unlock him and take him across the street, and they get some chai tea and lunch, and Michael has to pay for it all. And by the end of the week, Michael said, "Well, I'm out of money," and the guard said, "Okay." And the sea captain showed up, and I think this is a routine that happened every week in that jail. The sea captain got his labor from that jail. So that was the turning point in Michael's life, because they ended up loving each other. When the sea captain died, it was around 1968, and that's when Michael found out he had an inheritance from the sea captain. When Michael got that inheritance, that's when he knew he could really build here. He thought of the reservoir as a modern agricultural system. We had hundreds of vertical 2x4s holding all this plastic up, you know, to turn this pit into a hothouse so he could grow perfect fruits and vegetables. You wouldn't believe how much work it was. We had troughs of steel lining the entire bottom of the reservoir filled with dirt, and we were just cultivating things either in dirt or even hydroponically above ground. It was a neat experiment, but he had 3 or 4 failed businesses up until 1962. And then that whole thing ended with, I think he wasn't going to try farming anymore until his grandfather came home from a dinner one night, and he said, "Michael, I have your $1 million idea. I just came from a French restaurant, and you have a reservoir, and you can raise frogs. And that's the future." And Michael was so excited, and he didn't wait. You know, he had pollywogs within a couple of days, and within months we had these 2-pound toads jumping around in here, hundreds of thousands of them, making an awful racket. The reservoir is like this big open pit. It's an amphitheater. So it was like just projecting this growl that came out of here all night long, you know, and we had new neighbors over, you know, new tract houses over there, and Michael was worried about them. So one morning he just ended that business. He came out and pulled the plug, basically, turned the valve and opened the drain and washed all these frogs down the drain. There was a contractor building a plot of new tract houses down there, and the drain, there's a big concrete pipe that goes from this reservoir to the Dalton Wash, and it's about a mile. But about halfway in between, they were building these houses, and they had cut this drain out, severed it. And this fountain of water just suddenly squirted up into the air, and frogs were falling out of the sky, and created this huge flood that washed out all the new concrete work they did and all the new sidewalks. People described it as like a biblical scene with frogs raining down out of the sky. And then that was 1963, so there's this whole set of years that we just kind of prepared the reservoir for building. That's when we started digging tunnels into the side. Like, before that, we all had to enter the reservoir through ladders. In 1964 is when we dug the first tunnel. So that kind of preparation work went up to about 1967, and then 1968 is when he began building the bottle house. That whole house was built from bottles that were growing in a pile outside the packing house where my grandmother had all these parties. And so the house was built from the bottles and from free cement that he could pick up at the Irwindale plant. And everybody liked him. They would just let him sit there by the side. The trucks would pull up and their hoppers would get filled up with cement. All this powder would come out of a hopper and into the barrel, and a lot of it would spill over the sides, and that's what he could have for free. So he was just sitting there with his flat-nosed shovel, and he'd just pick up cement and bring it back here and build on that bottle house. The engine that we installed down there is a 30 horsepower Western pump engine. It's called the barbecue engine because when he installed it, he was in a hurry to get it running because he was a little bit resentful of all his mother's parties. He had that giant machine which is meant to pump hundreds of gallons of water per hour. He just had a little conveyor belt going down to a little hibachi, and that giant machine was turning 2 chickens on a spit. That was the pump for the city of Glendora. It's a 1917 engine, and Michael wanted it all his life. And 1963, he was only 23 years old, is when we went and got it out of the hills, and took about 3 or 4 days to get it down here. Michael wasn't sure he had permission to get it. And so a lot of the work that we did was at night. It was on a big concrete monument. These guys banged away at it and couldn't make any progress, so we came back home and sat around a table and made up little sticks of dynamite and went up the next night and put that around the monument and lit the fuse and came home. And we were able to jerk the machine off the base and pull it home on its flywheels. That's how they caught us, because we didn't realize the machine was so heavy that it left scars on the pavement all the way right into our driveway. So when the Edison company wanted to find it, they just followed the trail into our driveway. They asked Michael what he was doing, and Michael said, "Well, you haven't run the machine in 40 years, why do you want it?" They said, okay. They gave him a receipt and he paid $1 and he owned it. The first weight-driven clock that Michael got to see was Big Ben in England, and that happened when he was 18 or 19. Just literally sat down in front of the door and just stayed there until they let him in, and that was 3 days. He sat in front of that door of Big Ben, and he even eventually made a sign with felt pen that said, "Help me see Big Ben." After that, I think his vision of having his own clock tower was really cemented in. This clock and bells came in the early 80s. He found out about them. So Michael was sitting on the porch when he got the call saying that this thing was available and that they had a price. His best friend, who was one of his mentors, Lauren Ward, was sitting right next to Michael, and Michael was like negotiating for this clock, and he finally decided he couldn't afford it, and he hung up. And Lauren Ward asked him what was going on, and Michael told him what the price of the clock was, and Lauren said, well, I've never done anything for you. Why don't I buy it? And that's how the clock came to be, is like a gift from a friend. It was an amazing time of creativity. There's just always something you could do here. My parents had gotten divorced, so I was actually finding a more sense of stability here, building with Michael. I'll end this with a eulogy that was written by one of Michael's favorite fans, Criswell Goldberg. This was spoken at his memorial service, and it's the best thing that was written about him, I think. When Michael left the planet, the world lost one of its most unique people.
He was the unwilling recipient of the charismatic gene that attracted many people. Those of us fortunate enough to have crossed paths with him were the chosen ones. We got lucky. What we built was not a place, a bottle house, a box factory, a tin palace, a tree house, a castle. We got to build our lives. We got to create ourselves and a spot in the universe for our lives. We don't hold you responsible, Michael. We just thank you.